This is a presentation on the psychoanalytical structuralist approach in a developmental theoretical perspective. It's going to concern mostly Freud and Erikson. The main focus will be to explain the human development throughout the lifespan according to the structuralist theoretical perspective, that form of developmental stage theory of Sigmund Freud and Erik Erikson. Now, the psychoanalytical approach can be described basically kind of like looking at an iceberg. With an iceberg, we have just a tip that we see. So much of the iceberg is below water, and there's so much to still be uncovered. For the psychoanalytical approach, this is a metaphor for the unconscious. So, psychoanalytical approach really looks at that primary focus of the unconscious, the part that's beyond our awareness, and that is very much influenced by our emotions. And to get there, we have to go deep, obviously, because it's below the water, so to speak. There's a lot that's happening there, a lot that's symbolic, or a lot of things that, in terms of our behavior, that's not easy always to understand, and we have to go into very much these crevices to find that understanding. Now, the psychoanalytical theory is co-founded by Josef Breuer. He was an Austrian physician, and he did various studies with people, including the famous one with Anna O. We knew her as such, this interview he had done with her, and that ended up inspiring Sigmund Freud to follow in those footsteps. He ended up being a mentor for many years to Freud, who is often given credit also as a founder of Psychoanalytical. The idea here is to help people understand the mind and how it works. I give you the example of the iceberg that shows you the conscious and the unconscious. But it's the unconscious that has even more influence than the conscious behavior over our personality and the various things about us, the emotions, the sentiments, the idiosyncrasies, etc. Now, one example of psychoanalytical theory when it comes to early childhood is that we have experiences that are stored in the unconscious, and this has a powerful influence on our development in later ages as we go through the lifespan. Some of these relationships could have been frustrated over time, and these neurotic abnormal behaviors we have sometimes are connected with anxieties from our youth, obsessions from our youth, or maybe something else, that there are frustrations that lead to anxiety or obsessiveness later in life. One psychodynamic approach is the perspective that stresses that early experiences with parents is extensively what shapes our development. People who are included in this viewpoint of the psychoanalytical school of thought are people like Alfred Adler, Erik Erikson, Sigmund Freud, Karen Horney, Carl Jung, Jane Loevinger. When it comes to Freud and Erikson, Freud explained that childhood shapes the development, and Erikson continued with that, explaining how it expands through the lifespan, including beyond our childhood and adolescent years, going into the adult years. And lifespan development was taken much further by Erikson than it was by Freud. When you compare the two, for Freud, the primary motivation for human behavior was sexual nature. But for Erikson, it's different. It's social. And it's a desire to affiliate with others and also to identify oneself emotionally. This psychoanalytical theory has techniques in terms of how they do talk therapy. Psychoanalysis is talk therapy. And these techniques have been very influential in psychology. In fact, probably the most influential of all the different schools of thought. And that's why it's used for counseling very much so. In modern clinical psychology, you see the psychoanalytical one being used very much. Let's now look at Sigmund Freud specifically. Sigmund Freud lived in the 19th century to the 20th century. He is the most famous name of the psychoanalytical school of thought, most would argue. He has various contributions, especially his exploration of the unconscious. In fact, this whole use of talk therapy, inspired by Breuer, had inspired the rest of the people around him in that psychoanalytical school of thought, and they make use of psychoanalysis very much so. Dream analysis is another contribution, although again controversial, is often things with his name because of the sexualization of things and his idea about repressed wishes. Defense mechanisms has again its controversies, especially some women have taken issues with that. But for us right now, it's the 5 psychosexual stages of development. These we're going to see in depth. The first stage is what's called the oral. It's in that first year of birth. Here, the baby takes pleasure from eating, from the breast milk and then the early forms of food, solids, and from vocalizing. Those early forms of gibberish and some words, the early ones that they make. Second stage is the anal. This stage, for ages 1 to 3, the child takes pleasure from the retention or repulsion of feces. This is something where, again, he ends up causing a lot of controversy, Freud, because of this very vulgar way of expressing things. And idea again is this will to pleasure that he emphasizes constantly. The pleasure of this and the pleasure of that. This is where he ends up causing many people to go off tracks with him. They leave him, they go away, thinking that he is off tracks, especially when it comes to the third stage of the phallic, age 3 to 5. And that there would be some pleasure taken from touching the genitalia. And again, this idea of the Oedipus complex or the Electra complex causes huge divisions. People like Alfred Adler, people like Viktor Frankl, people like Carl Jung, eventually Erik Erikson, they all take issues with a lot of these ideas he brings up. He brings up some things that they could agree with, but various things, when it's all this sexualization, all this will to pleasure, they absolutely disagree. In fact, people like Alfred Adler will emphasize will to power, and people like Viktor Frankl will emphasize will to meaning. The fourth stage, the latency, is ages 6 to 11. The girl will identify with her mother, the boy will identify with his father. This identification with the same gender is important for Freud's fourth stage. Moving on to the fifth stage, as they become teenagers, ages 12 to 18, now they go through puberty and they have attraction to the opposite sex. So they are first with the same sex, meaning the parent, and then they move on to the opposite sex, meaning some child at their school, for example, or someone in their neighborhood they may feel attraction to. These ideas, again, there's those who will have some circumstances that bring up about this or that and have their dispute with Freud about. But ultimately, Freud's ideas here concerning the attractionness, this is where it goes back into will to pleasure. So, for example, some people will say, look, yes, this girl may like this boy in the neighborhood, but it doesn't mean because she likes him that she has all this will to pleasure for that. She may have a certain attraction in itself, but for her, other things, maybe the emotional, or maybe something of the idiosyncrasies that this boy does, or something like that, is what may actually be more interesting to her. And there's not a pleasure in it per se. It's maybe something that causes her to have some attention to those maybe actions that the person does, but without a pleasure element. And this is why a lot of people will pull away from Freud, this will to pleasure, saying it's not always there. Let's look at Erik Erikson. In fact, one who does dispute with Freud eventually. Now, Erik Erikson lived in the 20th century completely. Unlike Freud, who was older, was from the 19th century, he had come to recognize Freud's ideas, was attracted to it, eventually had disagreed with him, and especially said that there was one element, which is called sexuality, but there's other elements too in one's life. There's other factors, and not only one. And instead of having the 5 psychosexual, he changed that to 5 psychosocial, and then added another 3 stages beyond the early years. As you saw, Freud, by the time he reached adulthood, stops. That's the end of the development. It continues into the adulthood, what developed in the teenage stage. But that's not the case with Erikson. Adults, in fact, have 3 further developments, according to Erikson. So these 8 psychosocial stages each has a certain aim, a certain aspect they have to develop, and a crisis that must be faced. And if you succeed, you can move on to the next stage. If not, you have to be successful in that stage, because you cannot truly go on to other stages. Even though age-wise you are developing chronologically, you are not in a social emotional way. You're not truly developing in terms of your identity. You have to go back, do those stages as they should have been completed, and from then you can move on truly to that age group you're in. And that is over the lifespan. This whole social, emotional identity, the crisis that we have to face, the successful accomplishments which you continue on to the next stage, all of this is connected for Erik Erikson. Now, in comparing Erikson's stages of personality development versus Freud's personality development, we find that with Freud's first stage of the oral, in that first year, Erikson emphasizes the basic trust as what to succeed in, versus the crisis of the mistrust. Where Freud talked about the anal, Erikson talks about an autonomy instead of the crisis, shame or doubt. Where Freud emphasized the Oedipus complex and the Electra complex in his phallic, instead we have Erikson in his third stage, again the same time period around 3 to 5, 6, is the initiative versus guilt. So in the previous stage, the child had a sense of autonomy in the sense of being able to do various functions, and now takes the initiative to social interact. As we go on to the fourth stage, the latency of Freud becomes what's known as industry versus inferiority for Erikson. This whole work ethic that comes as a success versus the crisis of the inferiority, not being able to do something. And Freud's final stage of the genital has nothing in comparison with Erikson's identity, which doesn't have that sexualization to it. Instead, this emotional integrity, this understanding of oneself, is a success versus the crisis of the role confusion. Erikson continues on with 3 other developments in the adulthood, which again Freud did not have. So in that early years of 20s and 30s, you have that intimacy versus isolation. Person's now doing that interaction with other people in a more significant way. In that middle adulthood, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, they're producing things. This generativity is the success compared to the crisis of the stagnation. And finally, as they get older in their 70s, 80s, 90s, they mature, maybe even reaching 100, becoming a centenarian. There's the ego integrity as a success. They have accomplished, done things according to their abilities, and had produced things from family life to career, versus the crisis of despair of those who had failed to do what they're supposed to do. These are the 8 stages of Erikson in his psychosocial development. I leave you with a question. According to the structuralist theories, such as we've seen by Freud and Erikson and others in the psychoanalytical school of thought, does development actually occur primarily in response to internal or external factors? Think about that. Thank you for having watched.